Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by Christian Reeves, who is an international banking consultant from Puerto Rico. And we want to dive deep into what is going on currently in the international banking sector in Puerto Rico, because we've heard from Christian there is a lot going on at the moment. But before we start, I want to get a little bit of the context from Christian. Christian, how exactly does one become an international banking consultant?
Yes, exactly. So I'm an attorney from San Diego, California. I went to law school, did an MBA and a JD at University of San Diego. Worked in taxation for a number of years, and then focused on international taxation, then focused on international taxation for banks. And then moved into bank licensing and regulation. I've been working mostly international cases since maybe 2000, and I graduated in 2000 from law school. So working international banking cases since about 2010, including Puerto Rico and other jurisdictions like Panama, Belize, Cook Islands, basically all over the place, the typical Cayman Islands, the typical international banking havens. Since about 2014, Puerto Rico's really become the banking hub of international activity. The law was passed in 1989, then updated in 2012, and ever since about 2013, when it was primarily implemented, Puerto Rico's really been the hub of international banking activity. So I find myself focused there and working there for the last number of years.
And I think we're going to dive into why exactly since 2013 Puerto Rico has become such an important place for international banking. But first, can you tell us a little bit about who your clients are? Because I think most people hear international banking and they think JP Morgan, they think Goldman Sachs, they think these big behemoths, but those are not necessarily your clients, right?
No, I wish they were, but no, not even close. Typically, they're high net worth individuals that want to set up a bank. The banking law came in 2012, but we say 2013 because that's when it was really implemented and began operations. But since about 2013, from 2013 through 2017, you could set up a bank with about 550,000 in capital, which is a relatively low bar to entry for most people. Then after that, it was paid in capital was increased to about 5 million. And then in 2020, late 2024, 2025, it was increased to 10 million. So, over those number of years, from 2013 through 2024, most of the people who were investing in banks were, average high net worth individuals, average business owners that had some type or reason for wanting an international bank.
Can you talk us a little bit more about what these reasons might actually be? If I'm a high net worth individual, if I'm a business owner, why would I want to have an international bank in Puerto Rico? What advantages do I have from that?
Sure. Well, so why would you want an international bank? An international bank, as opposed to a general or domestic bank, can accept clients from anywhere in the world. Of course, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, so they have to be kosher with the U.S. government. So you can't take clients from Venezuela, Russia, places like that are off, that are not approved these days. But somebody who wants to conduct international business, someone who wants to support payments between, let's say, the United States and Mexico, somebody who wants a U.S. banking license to facilitate trade, import exports, letters of credit for a trade finance kind of bank, somebody who has a number of clients that they want to onboard. We see it with crypto businesses. We see it with e-commerce businesses. Hey, I've got a credit card processing company. I want to have a bank so I can be an issuing and acquiring bank, so I can become the underwriting bank for the credit card industries. So there's many different reasons why somebody would like it, and sometimes it's operated almost like a family office. Hey, I've got 10 billion in assets in my family fund. I don't have clients like that, but there are two or three that are operated as a family office. Most of my clients have always been reasonably well off entrepreneurs and business people who wanted to set up banks in Puerto Rico, and I also set up the two Chinese-owned banks that were in Puerto Rico. So a bank in the United States, you basically have to be a U.S. citizen if you're going to own a bank, and all of your customers have to come from the United States. Puerto Rico, your customers can come from anywhere, and your shareholders can come from anywhere, so long as you can prove your source of income, where the money is coming from to operate the bank. They will support non-U.S. shareholders and non-U.S. account holders.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, it's predominantly, I presume, non-US citizens that have significant international trade, both in the US and outside the US, and basically want a way to either consolidate their sort of trade activities or do some other financial services business that has a significant nexus to the US. And because of these less strict requirements, they decide to set up shop in Puerto Rico instead of on the continental US or in some other country in the region.
Well, yes, I would say 50, 60%, 65% are actually US owned.
Mm.
But my primary point being that it's not a requirement that you have to be a U.S. shareholder to own one of these banks.
So Puerto Rico has become, as you mentioned, the dominant player in international banking since 2013, compared to places like Bermuda, compared to places like the Cayman Islands. What is the sort of historical context as to why Puerto Rico has become such an interesting and such a unique place for banking?
Yeah, and you'll find that, for example, Cayman Islands, since its heyday, has declined and reduced its number of banks by about 70%. So there's definitely it's definitely not a growing market. It's definitely a shrinking market. The only growth market in international banking operations is Puerto Rico for a couple simple reasons. One, you can hold U.S. accounts. U.S. people can open accounts at these banks, and they're not subject to the FATCA reporting, which is a huge cost center for banks in Cayman Islands and Belize and places like that. So you can have U.S. clients in your international bank without the cost and headache of FATCA. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory and obviously not a U.S. state, which means it has the right to create its own banking laws as a territory. A state does not. And B, it has the ability to create its own tax laws. A bank in Puerto Rico pays only 4% in income tax. There's no federal income tax for a bank operating from Puerto Rico. That means its cost structure is far lower than a U.S. bank. A U.S. bank, their typical tax rates anywhere from 30 to 45%, depending on their state. You might say 30% for the Fed, and the rest depends on your state. Puerto Rico, literally, your only tax will be that 4% income tax. And that's only possible because Puerto Rico is a territory and not a state. All states are subject to federal income tax, where territories can set their own tax laws, and whatever income they generate from those tax laws, they keep.
Okay, putting things into context, starting 2012, 2013, Puerto Rico becomes quite willingly a center that attracts a lot of these international banks, people who are not necessarily the likes of the Wall Street behemoths, but rather high net worth individuals, etc., who want to set up banking operations in order to facilitate international trade, etc. And Puerto Rico is very successful in attracting a lot of capital in this respect. This continues up until roughly 2020 something, right?
Yeah, I would say 2024. It's important to note the reason for Puerto Rico doing this. They understand that their tax revenue is, they'll make some money from that or might not. That doesn't really matter. The primary point to them is bringing in high quality, high paying jobs to the island. So you'll note that chief compliance officers and loan officers and other related positions on the island their salaries have basically doubled over the last couple of years because of the increase of international banks. There's only 3 general banks on the island, but there are, I think, about 65 internationally licensed banks. So that means that the competition for the relatively small number of qualified individuals has greatly increased, and the salaries have greatly increased, and a lot more people are employed in these businesses. And that's really the whole point of the law. Maybe you'll bring some tax revenue, but primarily to bring in high-paying jobs to the island.
And a little bit more on the context of Puerto Rico is in the last 10 years, Puerto Rico's had quite a difficult time from the perspective of the economy, right? There was a hurricane in 2017. I hear that the
Yes.
financial state of the territory is also not optimal. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was two hurricanes back to back, Irma and Maria, in 2017. And I went through the first hurricane. I was in Puerto Rico, and then the second one was coming. And I said to myself, this is enough. I've had enough. So I went to the airport. I said, give me a ticket somewhere. And they said, well, it's $7,500 to go to New York or $350 to go to Cancun. Cancun it was. I was out right before the hurricane arrived, about a day and a half. And then it took them a number of years, maybe 3 years to recover from the hurricane. But they've also, their real big issue is their electrical grid and power availability on the island. It goes out frequently. There are billions and billions of dollars in need of repairs in power and other things. And that's been a function of just poor management and corruption over the years. But that's decades and decades old issues that have just been continuing and continuing on. Currently, the power company is basically run by a U.S. group called Luma, and they're trying to do their thing. But for example, on New Year's Eve, the power went out
Mm.
before they were, because Puerto Rico is actually the first U.S. territory and state to experience New Year's Eve because it's 1 hour ahead of East Coast time. And they were supposed to be big on TV, but all their power went out, and it was a disaster, as is common.
Okay, so this is the context, right? Puerto Rico passes a banking law in 2012, starts attracting most international banking businesses from 2013. The capital requirements are low, so you get dozens of international banks set up in Puerto Rico. This attracts a lot of high paid jobs, and Puerto Rico needs them because it's going through a lot of financial difficulties, in part due to the hurricanes that came back to back. And yet, a lot changes in 2024. What happens in 2024?
Yeah, so paid-in capital was increased to 5 million in maybe 2017. It was we don't have a fixed date. It was much more just being implemented by regulators so that the law wasn't actually changed. Then in 2024, have a
Sorry. Can
lot.
you
You have
can you elaborate a little bit on what exactly that means?
well, sure. So in the Banking Act called Act 273 came in 2012 and implemented in 2013. That requires minimum paid-in capital of 550,000 plus a CD of 250,000, right? So you could
This is to
basically start
start a new bank, right?
yes. So you could start a new bank for less than $1 million, including your build out, which attracted a lot of general entrepreneurs who had no experience in banking, didn't necessarily have qualifications, and certainly didn't have billions of dollars backing them. Right. So these are just entrepreneurs who wanted to join the banking economy. And that's wildly different than what you'll find in the United States. And again, these banks don't compete with U.S. banks because A, they're allowed to bring in deposits from abroad where U.S. banks cannot, and B, they can have non-U.S. shareholders. C, their tax rate is 4%. So they're not really, they're also not FDIC insured. So they're not a liability to the U.S. They're just international businesses that operate as banks. So in 2012, the paid-in capital was very low. I did two or three licenses in those times with those type of capital requirements, and then regulators said, "Well, look, these banks are failing at an unreasonable rate. They're bringing too much risk, reputational risk, and transactional risk, and risk to the system. So we're going to increase the capital to 5 million." And they just did that kind of by fiat, saying, "Hey, all banks have to have 5 million paid in capital." They didn't actually go to the Puerto Rican Senate and get the law changed. Regulators
So
can do that. That's common in the U.S.
okay, so regulators just one day to another decided to change the rules.
Yes, I mean, they sent it out for comment. They gave advance notice and things like that. And regulators do have that power. I'm not saying they did anything inappropriate. They can say, hey, the law allows you to set up a bank for 550,000, but we have the ultimate say on who we're giving a license to. So, hey, if you don't have 5 million, we're not going to let you in.
Okay, so that I imagine slowed down the business considerably in terms of new bank formations.
Yes, yeah. It slowed down the business and it increased the quality of the operators. Both things are true. And in 2024, it was again increased by actually a change in the law to 10 million paid in capital plus $1 million CD. So you need 11 million in cash, basically sitting in an account before you can even be considered for a new license. And existing banks had 3 to 4 years, basically, depending on a number of factors, to reach that 10 million paid in capital. So if you are a guy who, if your net worth is 10 million, you're going to have to go out and raise money, or you're going to have to sell your bank. So that created a number of sales and other activity in the industry.
Okay, so basically, at some point, the existing banks who had come in, say, in 2013, 2014, they set up a bank for roughly $500,000, plus, other startup costs, etc., for less than $1 million. And then 10 years later, they find themselves in a situation where you need to raise 10 times more of that in order to continue business.
That's exactly correct. And so a number of them were forced to sell for financial reasons. A number of them just kind of shut down for various reasons. But yeah, so we saw a lot of consolidations between 2020, 2025.
Okay. So, help me understand a little bit why banking regulators decided to do this. Why do they care if there's relatively high amount of Puerto Rican international banks failing? There's a lot of restaurants that fail on a day-to-day basis, and yet no one's stopping you from starting yet another pizza shop on the corner. Why are regulators against? Why are they doing this?
So I would say two reasons. One, you could call it risk to the U.S. banking system, but it's much more just reputational risk to the U.S. banking system, because they're international banks, but they're U.S. banks with ABA numbers, with SWIFT access. So they are traditional banks. And B, I think, which is more important, is they're holding customer deposits and lending out those deposits. So when a bank goes under, it certainly could take millions or tens of millions or 100 million, hundreds of millions of customer deposits with them. So, because what happens is, let's say you have a bank, and just to use round numbers, it's got 100 million in deposits. That bank can take 80 million of that, 80%, and lend it into the United States, or make loans with that money. If a number of those
Mhm.
loans go bad and a lot of people call their deposits, that bank is going to go under. Then it's going to go into receivership. The lawyers are going to suck up basically whatever's left, and
Yeah.
the account holders are going to be left with pennies on the dollar.
And the regulators care about this for pure reputational reasons, right? Because they're not FDIC insured, right? There's no cost to the taxpayer other than it kind of looks bad.
Yeah, it kind of looks bad, but yeah, it's just the risk of the depositors and the image.
Okay, and just so I understand, are these international banks, are they soliciting actively U.S. clients? Are they going on to the mainland U.S. and saying, "Hey, guys, you should, bank with us. We'll pay you a higher interest rate"? Is that happening?
Yeah, it definitely happens. Probably 40% of total deposits are from the U.S. That's really just a wild guess, but it's kind of my feeling from seeing these things. And
Okay.
yeah, they absolutely can compete with U.S. banks in that capacity. They can provide higher returns, which means that they can make loans at higher risk, or maybe lower volumes that possibly create higher risk to the depositors. So there's certainly combined issues there. For example, it might be a bank that, hey, we've got a niche, we're going to lend to a certain type of business against their credit card receivables, and those returns are going to be 10, 15%.
Mhm.
Compared to a traditional bank making 2, 3%, and we're happy to give our depositor 5%, 7% on their CD, which a U.S. bank could not. Smaller banks have that capability, where a giant behemoth, it would just be impossible, first of all, to deploy that much capital in a cost-effective manner. B, they're only investing. The U.S. banks are typically investing only like in U.S. treasuries and mortgages and things like that. Banks in Puerto Rico are typically investing in higher risk or more interesting items.
Okay, I understand. Okay, so by the sounds of it, the Puerto Rican regulator at some point decided to slowly start taking away the banking licenses of people that it had originally already given licenses to. Why is this an important story? Why is this something that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, so it's a very important and interesting situation from a business perspective because these are people who have invested millions of dollars and built up their business to a certain level. But regulators are saying, no, we want that. If you're not at the 10x level, you're not at the 10 million paid in capital. We want you out of the industry. And it's also true that the Fed is pushing regulators in Puerto Rico. The U.S. Fed is pushing regulators in Puerto Rico to reduce the number of banks. I think that at the height it had 70 banks, which is a lot. A typical other jurisdictions, for example, other international jurisdictions like Belize have three or three or four. The number of domestic banks in Puerto Rico is only three. So 70 international banks in a small territory is a pretty large number. So the Fed is perceiving risk there for whatever reason. And I think it's primarily reputational. As you already pointed out, there's not really much going on. There's no FDIC. There's no risk to the taxpayer. There's risk to the depositors, but that's a business decision.
Has there? Okay, I think one interesting aspect is that it's the New York Fed that is pressuring the Puerto Rican regulator to reduce the number of banks. I mean, the New York Fed is in New York, and Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. What say do they have in this?
Well, quite a bit. So we generally explain it as the Fed regulates the regulator in Puerto Rico, and the regulator in Puerto Rico regulates these banks.
Mm.
So the regulator in Puerto Rico is beholden to the U.S. Fed because remember they're also the regulator of all the general banks and the credit unions and everything else in Puerto Rico. So basically, the entire economic system on the island is run by the U.S. And that's why we can also say that these are U.S. banks that have ABA numbers and other things. And the other item that the U.S. Fed controls is access to what we call FedWire. FedWire
Mm.
is the ability to send and receive wires, we'll say, in a very cost-effective manner. And five international banks on the island have FedWire access, and the rest do not. So, as they grow the number of as they increase the capital and grow the quality of the banks, they're hoping that more banks will be able to get FedWire access. And FedWire access is what basically can make a transactional bank profitable because when you work through a correspondent bank, you might be paying $25 to $100 per wire going out. A wire transfer through the Fed is actually like 89 cents.
Mm.
A ACH through the Fed, there's Fed Now and there's the typical ACH connectivity, and that's less than a penny. So when Bank of America sends a wire, they're paying less than $1, and when they send an ACH, they're paying less than a cent is their actual cost. But they're passing that on to banks that are through which they're providing correspondent services at $25 to $100.
So I think it's very interesting that the Fed is playing such a pivotal role in this tightening of the international banking sector in Puerto Rico, because there's been a lot of news about the Fed, particularly in relation to regulatory pressures that they've applied to banks on the continental US that were servicing certain industries,
Yeah,
particularly
correct.
fintech and crypto, exactly. So there was a lot of headlines around debanking, around the fact that the federal regulators were applying pressure on US banks to stop serving crypto clients, fintech clients, or even, just making, not explicitly saying that you shouldn't be serving these clients, but just making life very hard for the banks that actually did. Do you think the two stories are related?
Yeah, and I think it's because Puerto Rico in the 2024 law included sections on crypto, which
Interesting.
is the custody of digital assets is how we phrase it. So
Hmm.
a bank cannot operate as a crypto exchange, but it can provide custody of digital assets. It can also provide custody of other types of assets, and gold has always been written into law since about 2012. So yeah, there was a lot of hope for the crypto industry in Puerto Rico. For example, there's FV Bank, Frank Valley,
Mm.
in Puerto Rico, and they they've been struggling for a couple of years trying to build out a crypto friendly bank. They had some successes and some failures along the way, and there's been two or three others. But yeah, it is specifically written into the law, and it's always been a hope that a quality crypto operator will set up in Puerto Rico. And it would be for on ramping and off ramping. So you could do in the e-commerce space or the credit card acquiring space, on ramping and off ramping of crypto customers, and also just the exchange between cash and say Bitcoin.
Has there been any? Okay, so there's been a lot of hopes pinned on a crypto bank out of Puerto Rico. Hasn't quite materialized yet, although there's been a few attempts, and the 2024 law seems to open the door for it. Has there been any successes in terms of fintechs? Because fintechs are also an industry that has had some sort of regulatory pressure under the previous Biden administration.
Yeah, well, there are some big time, billion-dollar companies that are looking at it closely, but there have not been any banks that have launched, in the fintech or the crypto space.
Okay. Because I could see that as potentially something that would be an interesting business opportunity, but on the other hand, maybe alarming to regulators in the US. If you set up a neobank based out of Puerto Rico that starts soliciting retail clients on the continental US, then that could potentially be quite dangerous because you might end up with millions of Americans in banking at a US bank that has nonetheless no FDIC insurance.
Right. Yes, yes, and there's no limit that these depositors don't have to be high net worth individuals or meet as you would see in a broker dealer, that you have to have a certain net worth to invest in a high risk product. Anybody can open an account in Puerto Rico.
Have there been any attempts with regards to stable coins, which is at the intersection of crypto and fintech? There's a lot of discussion lately with regards to stable coins. Does the 2024 law mention them at all?
No, so there have been attempts of people trying to launch these banks, but none of them have succeeded or been able to do it. It wouldn't be the bank wouldn't actually issue a coin. A bank would just provide custody of the assets, be it a coin or whatever it is. You would have to have an exchange that is licensed. An internationally licensed exchange, for example, could set up a bank in Puerto Rico and operate that bank. It wouldn't necessarily have to be like a Coinbase, who recently moved their international operations to Bermuda. But yeah, so you certainly could, but it hasn't been done, and the coin wouldn't be actually under the bank. It would just be held by the bank as an off balance sheet custody of assets.
When you read the news, Christian, about the reduction in banking licenses, most of it is tarnished with bad actors, corruption, crime, money laundering. That's a few articles that I've read. Is that
Yeah.
actually what's going on, or what's the actual story? Why
Well,
should people what truth should people take
so
from this?
no, absolutely, there have been some bad actors, but you'll also find, I would say, the majority of them, of the banks that have been shut down over the years, have been called money laundering because the activities that they were doing were no longer politically popular. For example, Puerto Rico was the number one connectivity between the US and Venezuela. But when Maduro came in, all of those banks were forced to cease those types of activities. And there was, if you look up Ital Bank, the word like Italy and Ital, ITAL Bank, you'll see articles going back to 2012 or 10 or whatever it was, where they were actually touted as the state bank for Venezuela. Um, and so, back in the day, it was perfectly fine and perfectly acceptable, but then it became politically inappropriate. So now we're going to taint it all as money laundering and illegal activities.
Yeah. Do
And
you
it's
think
it's
things
those
will?
banks that kept trying to do that activity, right? So Ital Bank, for example, they stopped all their activity and they're still in operation, right? Some did not. Some tried to do it under the radar, and those are the ones that got slammed by the feds.
And what does it look like if you're going to be debanked? Like, what does that actually mean in reality for a bank and maybe a someone who's deposited money with that bank?
So a debanked is somebody who's typically politically, it's usually a politically motivated activity. But for example, they were debanking well-known Republicans during the Biden administration, which means that it means that basically that the Fed, through its audit process, is going to most of the banks saying, hey, you can't open accounts for this particular person. And that means they're being debanked. And that didn't happen in Puerto Rico because they don't have really Fed audits. And there's not really there's no big activity on the island in debanking, but it certainly was a major issue in the United States. And hopefully under the current administration, it will no longer be. It seems like they're being very aggressive and threatening legal action against those who debank. Because obviously the party that got debanked is in power now, and that's probably going to be hell to pay.
Do you think there's going to be any rowing back of these policies, which will change in 2024 with the new administration, or do you think there'll be more of the same?
It's very hard to say. I mean, obviously, the current administration is more business focused and more entrepreneurial, so they might allow international banks. What is interesting is that the banking commissioner in Puerto Rico, the name of the entity is OSIF, and the banking commissioner recently resigned because there was a change in the governor on the island. And the new governor appoints her new cabinet and the primary positions, just like in the U.S. So the current commissioner resigned. So it's going to be very interesting to see who comes in as interim commissioner and who ultimately comes in as the final commissioner for this 4-year term of the current governor. And then that really will set the focus. And it certainly might be that the U.S. Fed is more relaxed in the way that it deals with Puerto Rico. I don't think that we're going to see, for example, a great number of FedWire accounts being approved or anything like that, but maybe they'll be less stringent with some of these entrepreneurial banks, because really these are banks that are there to conduct business. They're trying to be true neobank entrepreneurs in an industry that's typically been dominated by billion-dollar players.
One of the high-profile cases that I first heard of with regards to this regulatory situation in Puerto Rico is the case of Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff is a well-known proponent of investing in gold. He, like many other high net worth individuals, had a bank in Puerto Rico and at some point was forced to sell it, I believe. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, so I didn't work on his case. So I've met him and I've known other people who have worked with him. And he's living in Puerto Rico. And so, yeah, the government's version of the case is Peter Schiff's bank, Euro Pacific. Actually, and I've known them for decades. They started out in Vanuatu, in St. Vincent. They started out in St. Vincent and moved to Puerto Rico a few years ago. And the government's version of the case is he was helping people in Australia to avoid income tax by hiding their money in Puerto Rico. It made it onto a 60 Minutes episode in Australia, and that really brought a lot of negative attention to Puerto Rico that the government didn't like. At that time, Puerto Rico was being put on kind of a gray list of money laundering havens or not money laundering, tax havens.
Which list?
It's kind of a gray list between saying that Puerto Rico was a tax haven.
But is this the gray
not like
list
the OECD list?
Yeah, so it's not the one that is run by the Financial Action Task Force, right? It's a separate one. Okay.
Puerto Rico was on that list shortly. I think it lasted about 2 days before the U.S. called them up and said, no, we ain't doing this.
Okay.
So that was very short-lived. But they didn't want to be considered a tax haven, even though their tax rate's 4%. But that's how the government would phrase, I think, or steelman their case of what happened to Peter Schiff's bank, that he was helping people in Australia avoid Australian income tax. It drew too much negative attention, and they wanted him out.
So
I think other people would view it differently. Other people would, because he actually sued, I think, that the 60 Minutes or some of the news producers and won kind of a defamation case, if I recall. He would claim that he was completely innocent and had nothing to do with any of that, and it was just a complete BS witch hunt on the part of the government.
So in terms of what actually happened with his bank, was it the case that his license, like that of many others, was not renewed by the regulator, or was it something else?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what happened. So he gets into trouble and they refuse to renew his license. He can sue them, obviously and that could take years. But what the government does is when they refuse to renew a license and you litigate, that gets into the press, and now all of your depositors will bolt, right? They don't want to get caught. So the government action forces all the depositors to leave. But that means that if you've lent 50%, 80% of your total deposits, you've lent that out to something. You're not able to cover all those depositors. Now your bank becomes insolvent by force, by intentional action from regulators and government agencies, right? But you've become insolvent through no fault of your own, and now your bank is being closed down.
Christian, one of the things that I'm struggling to understand a little bit is on a theoretical level, I understand, okay, these banks are doing lending because they're banks, right? That's what banks do. Banks lend money. But in terms of practical business applications, I'm struggling to understand with the use case of I need a loan. I'm thinking, I don't know, I want a mortgage, I want a business loan, I want something. The first person I'm going to call is a bank in Puerto Rico. Like, how does that actually work? Like, can you give
Oh
us a
yeah,
few
so
use
so that's
cases?
exactly the point. Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah, go
yeah. No,
ahead.
something was going off in my headphones. I'm sorry. Yeah, so no, 100%. That's exactly correct. That banks in Puerto Rico cannot compete with big mortgage lenders or whatnot. So they have to find uh, niches in the market. For example, let's say you're a bank that facilitates transactions, cross-border payments or trade with Mexico. And a Mexican national wants to purchase a home in the United States but doesn't have any U.S. credit. They might issue a mortgage in that case. You're a bank that you're a business that is considered high risk in the United States. For example, in some of your fintechs or your crypto businesses need capital, they can get it from Puerto Rico, where they couldn't get it from a traditional U.S. bank. You want to lend into like what are called merchant cash advance businesses or something like that typically are not serviced by other banks. You might bring in capital, let's say, you might bring in deposits from Latin America or Australia in the case of Peter Schiff's bank, and you might deploy those in different, more unique industries.
I see. It's predominantly, I guess, depositors are predominantly highly international businesses and high net worth individuals, and they're predominantly lending to either, industries that are not served very often by existing banks. I don't know if cannabis would fit under this description. Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah,
But
probably not because we still consider we still consider Puerto Rico run by the Fed and it's still a federal crime.
right.
And banks in Puerto Rico, there's a small niche that banks in Puerto Rico can't really deal with cash. Is that there's no effective way to do that even because what would you do? Ship it to the island?
Yeah.
Cannabis business is all cash.
Yeah.
There's always been talk about building like a stable coin or something like that to serve the industry. But somebody like Weed Maps putting out an app and a coin and something. But
Mhm.
it's never come to fruition.
I think one of the interesting things going forward is a lot of the people that were in the regulatory seat in the US that were applying pressure onto Puerto Rico are no longer there, right? They went
Mhm.
out with the outgoing administration. The administration also changed in Puerto Rico. And in addition to that, the incoming US administration is quite interested in crypto, quite interested in deregulation. How do you see the Puerto Rican international banking industry moving forward?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful. So there are a number of banks that are in litigation and have been shut down for really de minimis reasons, just because they want to reduce the number of banks. And I'm hopeful that under the new administration, under a new commissioner who would come in the next couple months, that the industry, maybe it'll kind of get back to its roots to being an entrepreneurial type business, much more business friendly, entrepreneurial minded banking industry, providing services to companies and industries and businesses and cross-border transactions that are just not available from the large banks. And there's certainly a good reason why they're not, because a small bank could enter an industry where, hey, that maybe the total transaction flow is just 50 million or 100 million. That's a big deal to a small little bank. But you go to JP Morgan or Wells Fargo, that's, well, we're not going to get into that. That's too much headache and not enough return, not enough volume for us. Why would we even bother? So these niche banks really do provide a service in the entrepreneurial space and for the business-minded, international, cross-border focused operations.
And is there an opportunity perhaps with the thing is currently dominating the headlines is the imposition of tariffs in the US against Canada, against Mexico, against China. There is a lot of talk of international trade slowing down. Does Puerto Rico have a role to play in this, being a US territory?
Yeah, so there certainly wouldn't be any type of tariffs or issues if you are producing a product or operating a business from Puerto Rico, and there are a number of there are some good sized banks. For example, Face Bank, definitely not related to Facebook, but the name of the bank is called Face Bank, that does cross border payments between Mexico, Brazil, and the United States. And there's a couple others. There's a Mexican owned bank on the island as well. And so there are certainly a lot of already existing connectivities that if somebody wanted to either build their own type of their own financial structure in Puerto Rico or rely on one of the existing ones, they certainly could avoid the tariffs and operate in that manner. And also operate in a very tax efficient way because, again, the tax rate on these banks is only 4%, and they're not paying any federal income tax.
I understand. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if the normal trade routes are somehow blocked or become more expensive, then people are going to be looking for opportunities and for, ways around the rules. And Puerto Rico as a US territory might just be able to capture some of that.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in the financial services sector.
Christian, what are some, this is a very interesting topic, but I'm sure a lot of people, when you meet them at parties and you tell them what you work at, they have their opinions about what you do. What are some misconceptions that people have about the international banking industry in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, well, or just international banking in general. One, that there's a lot of that it's kind of there to avoid taxes or something like that. Well, it's just a part of the U.S. system. It's a territory. It's not a state. It has the right to create its own tax code. And the reason that they do that is not to help people avoid taxes, is because they want to bring quality jobs to the island. And they've absolutely been successful in that, bringing thousands of jobs through all these different banks. That's one thing. Two, that there's a lot of illegal activity or money laundering in Puerto Rico. Absolutely not. The vast majority of improper activities that occurred were when the political winds shifted and the bank didn't act quickly enough to raise its sails and move with those winds. This very specifically Venezuela, and that's been a big issue in Puerto Rico. So I would say that if somebody wants to set up an international bank that is part of the U.S. banking system, Puerto Rico is the only place where you can do it. For example, if you set up a bank in Belize, you're going to be subject to FATCA. You're going to be subject to all these the OECD lists, for example. You're going to have all of the risks of an international bank, but none of the benefits of being part of the U.S. Based system. It is true. That's why Puerto Rico has grown so quickly. And that entrepreneurial mindset that I always try to get back to is where I hope under the new administration, that's where it will end up, where small business owners and entrepreneurs will be out there using these banks in industries and places and opportunities that don't exist, bringing quality jobs to the island and operating in both a professional but also a business-minded way of operating that is not available through a U.S. bank.
Well, in terms of shifting political winds, given the headlines recently, it might be the case that the whole Venezuela story will change soon again, and then that might be another opportunity for Puerto Rico.
100%, and that was the driving. That I think that was the driving factor between it in creating some of these laws. And most of the first banks were owned by Venezuelans, Venezuelan Americans. But most of the first banks that were set up were set up for that purpose. And Ital is a solid example of a bank that did followed all the rules, did exactly what it was supposed to do. But if you look back at its history, it was set up for that purpose and was an official bank of the Venezuelan government.
Christian, thank you very much for walking us through the international banking industry and for telling us about how the current administration in Puerto Rico has been limiting already existing banking licenses on the island. Is there something that we have missed that we should discuss on this topic?
No, I think it's very well covered. I'm very hopeful that under the current U.S. administration, under the new Puerto Rican administration, that we'll be able to get back to business, and they'll see the benefit of allowing entrepreneurs to do their thing on the island.
All right, Christian, thank you very much.
Thank you.